Hello everybody, this is the Tokyo FinTech podcast with a new episode that is neither fin nor tech. Today we're here with Nicolas Michelon, who's the editor at Asia Power Watch and the founder of Asia Intelligence Advisory. So we're going to cover lots of macroeconomic theme and competitive themes. Welcome Nicolas, good to have you here.
Thank you, Norbert. Thanks for having me.
Obviously, the coronavirus has taken over the news a bit, but we had planned this for a while, and our topic was Carlos Ghosn and the implications of the scandal. Is it a scandal?
First of all, I think I'm going to give probably a bit of a reminder to everyone that when we talk about the Carlos Ghosn case, okay, we're making a shortcut here. It sells. It sells. We've all seen the pictures on the video. On TV, we've seen him getting arrested, we've seen him being presented to the judge. We've followed very closely his escape. In fact, my view is that this is not so much a Carlos Ghosn issue as it is a Renault-Nissan issue. Carlos Ghosn is just the tip of the iceberg. He's the guy who was there, probably at the wrong place at the wrong time. He embodied French interests in the Renault-Nissan alliance. And for the reasons I'm going to give later, I'm going to develop that. The Japanese needed to get him because he was embodying these interests. To sum it all up, if it had been Mickey Mouse representing French interests, they would have gone after Mickey Mouse.
We talked before as well, he's obviously been there a long time. The question is, why now?
It's a good question. Why now? Why did it take the Japanese so long to be unhappy with the alliance, with the terms of the alliance? And also another question is, why did it take Carlos Ghosn so long not to understand Japanese culture? Because he had been at the helm basically pretty much since 1999. We were closing in on 20 years. Of course, he wasn't living in Japan full time. He was traveling back and forth, spending the last few years, I think he was spending pretty much half of his time in Japan. Okay, the timing, indeed, we get the first 10 years of the alliance, so 99 to slightly before the 2010s. Renault really invests a lot of money to put Nissan back on track. Nissan was close to bankruptcy when Renault stepped in 99. So the first 10 years, the Japanese are taking the hits. They're accepting the drastic diet that is being imposed by Renault through Carlos Ghosn. Carlos Ghosn closes factories. Carlos Ghosn destroys close to 30,000 jobs in Japan. Carlos Ghosn strangles suppliers. He divides the number of suppliers by 2, and the remaining half are basically being strangled on the terms, on the prices. Something that not so many people know about is that the consolidation of the steel sector in Japan was actually because Carlos Ghosn was pressuring the steel suppliers for Renault, Nissan, and Mitsubishi. So that triggered an actual consolidation of the steel sector. So the first 10 years, really, they're taking the hit, but they're pretty much appreciative of the fact that so much money was invested in Renault and that the job is getting done. The problem comes in the second half of the story, the last 10 years. And most particularly, it starts in 2015. 2015, basically, the current French president, Emmanuel Macron, at that time, he's Minister of Economy. And as Minister of Economy, he pushes through a legislation that had been put forward by his predecessor, but he applies that legislation to Renault. And basically the idea is that the French state, being a stakeholder in Renault, from now on has the right for double voting rights without increasing its share in Renault. The problem is that he doesn't even tell Renault that he's going to apply that law to Renault. He doesn't tell Carlos Ghosn in advance. So Carlos Ghosn is caught by surprise, seeing that the French state, as a shareholder, suddenly has double voting rights. And imagine the people sitting in Yokohama at the headquarters of Nissan. They think from Yokohama, our main shareholder, which is Renault, is not even able to tell us in advance that the French state is going to receive double voting rights. And may I remind everybody that Nissan has no voting right in Renault. So suddenly the Japanese think, okay, not only is our number 2 car manufacturer, Nissan, controlled by a French car manufacturer, foreigner, but that car manufacturer is actually now under total control of the French government, of a French state.
Was that specifically Lex Renault legislation that was put in place to take tighter control of Renault, or is it a broader industrial policy?
It was a broader policy. Okay. Actually, the name of the law is Florange Bill, and Florange was the name of the steelworks that were the French steelworks that were taken over by the Indian Mittal. So initially that law was put in place to make sure that the Indian steel player Mittal, by buying Arcelor, could not close the steelworks because the French state had a say in it, and they doubled that say. But according to that law, any company that the French state had stakes in could fall under that. And Emmanuel Macron, one of the first things he did was to apply that to Renault. So the working relationship between Renault and Nissan, he weakened the position, the personal position of Carlos Ghosn, because what he also did something else. People were getting a little bit annoyed that Carlos Ghosn was earning double salary from Renault and from Nissan, and those two salaries being paid in Amsterdam at the holding level. So he wasn't being taxed on his income either in France nor in Japan. People in France were a little bit, Emmanuel Macron at that time is preparing his candidacy to become president. He needs to have a quick victory in front of the French people. So he starts saying this double remuneration that Carlos Ghosn gets, this is wrong. He should give up one of them, or at least he should accept that both of them are being reduced. If he doesn't, I may legislate on that. So there's like a second whammy for Carlos Ghosn. The first whammy was the law, which weakened the position of Renault. Second whammy weakens his own person. Again, imagine you're at Nissan in Yokohama. This is the signal that the hunt for Carlos Ghosn can start. Even France will not support him.
So that's 2015.
So that's 2015. And then things start getting into motion. Carlos Ghosn is under pressure to abandon his CEO post at Nissan, because people are telling me you cannot be both CEO of Renault, CEO of Nissan, and chairman of the holding. So something's got to give. So he gives up his CEO position at Nissan and he names Hiroto Saikawa, the man who later will be the front guy in the hunt for Carlos Ghosn. He actually put him there himself. So he abandons that position. He still holds at that time the chairman seat of the Renault-Nissan Alliance holding in the Netherlands. And then on November 19, 2018, he is called by the Japan headquarters to Japan for a very important meeting. He initially doesn't want to go because I think he has a family event. So he says, why don't we do like video conference? And no, this requires your physical presence. So he flies over and he gets arrested right at the airport. He's sent to the prison of Kosuge prison in Tokyo right away on the very same day. The funny story is that the day after, so November 19, he received a visit from the French ambassador in Japan. And the French ambassador in Japan informs him, be careful, Nissan is turning against you. He's already in jail.
Was a bit late, apparently.
A little bit late. One day too late.
It's also then Saikawa has been handpicked by Ghosn. So poor judgment on Ghosn's part, picked the wrong guy.
Definitely poor judgment. This is actually confirmed by many other nominations he made. And many of the names of those people he made at Nissan headquarters actually ended up being the same very guys who turned against him. One of them is still at Nissan. The name has been put forward by the press. He's a foreign executive. He's still there in the legal department. And he's actually one of the two persons who actually helped the internal investigation that Nissan launched to start gathering evidence against Carlos Ghosn. So that person is still there. He's been nominated by Carlos Ghosn. Obviously, not the best human resource manager. The question is also, how did he become that oblivious of the fact that the Japanese were growing increasingly unsatisfied with the capital arrangement between Nissan and Renault? Nissan owning only 15% in Renault with no voting rights, and Renault owning 43% with voting rights. This, to me, is very similar to the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. When France and England get the victory over Germany, they impose Treaty of Versailles. People remember massive punishing measures. Billions of Deutschmark to be paid back. The US president warns France and England. They said, you should not do that. You won the war. Don't go and humiliate Germany. This is not necessary. Let Germany the means to build back. Otherwise, you're planting the seeds for revenge. And we know what happened a few decades later. This is exactly the same kind of story. The capital arrangement between Renault and Nissan had become tantamount to a Treaty of Versailles for the Japanese. You gotta remember one thing. The past 5 years, 2/3 of the sales, worldwide sales of the alliance, are made by Nissan and Mitsubishi. Half of the consolidated earnings come from Nissan alone. Most of the cash, Nissan. All the cash that Renault has, it's actually the value of the cross-shareholdings. If you remove that cross-shareholdings, there's almost no cash at all. Technology, it's Nissan. Most of the trademark models that we've seen put forward by the two brands Renault and Nissan, be it in EV, Nissan Leaf versus Renault Zoe, be it in sports car, Nissan GT-R versus Renault Alpine, every time the Nissan model came 2 or 3 years earlier. And most of the technology from the Renault model that came 2 or 3 years after comes from Nissan. So definitely Treaty of Versailles. And when Emmanuel Macron, with this law and with the message that he sends about Carlos Ghosn, with that kind of message being sent, then the whole thing, the whole machine, the whole, I would say, nationalistic machine within Nissan gets moving. There's obviously links outside of Nissan. Nissan could not have done all that by themselves. The prosecutor's office of Tokyo obviously was spearheading this, but they got information that they should not have gotten without the help of Nissan people. They obviously benefited from new legislation in Japan, which was introduced a couple of months before the internal investigation started, which was a new form of plea deal system which didn't exist before. And that enabled some staff at Nissan to give away information in exchange for legal immunity. And obviously, there's the big question mark of what happened at the level of METI, Ministry of Economics, Trade and Industry. Was the go-ahead sent directly by METI at that level, or at least with their approval? It's difficult to imagine that this whole machine could have done moving without at least the tacit approval of METI.
Now, this is the automobile industry, which is an industry of the 20th century. Is this old people fighting over an old industry? Do we think from an overall macroeconomic perspective they should be focusing on innovation and building industries for the 21st century? What is going on at the economic warfare level?
Interesting question. There's two levels in your question. The first level is this a case of economic warfare? Is there really this nationalist element versus the globalist element? There's one story that I'd like to remind the listeners. About 10 years before Renault stepped in, there had been a war already within Nissan between nationalist elements and what we could call globalist elements. That war happened because, as people may remember, in 1985, the Plaza Accord, US and Europe managed to impose to Japan that they revalue the Japanese yen to lose competitiveness on their exports. And what do the Japanese do? To compensate that loss in competitiveness, they start diversifying and outsourcing some of their factories elsewhere. So they start closing in Japan, reopening in China, reopening in Europe, reopening in the US. Some of the most nationalist elements within Nissan, and people should remember that Nissan in Japanese means made in Japan. The most nationalist elements within Nissan, they don't look at it very favorably. And especially one man, the person who was at that time the head of the main trade labor union within Nissan, and he eventually became the president of the Federation of Auto Workers in Japan. That guy is a big-time nationalist, and he thought was, for every factory that Nissan is going to open, let's say in England, which is what they did, the first one that they opened overseas was in Sunderland, every job they create in Sunderland, one job is going to be destroyed in Japan. So he actually was opposing this movement of internationalization of Nissan in the mid-80s, and he was actually threatening labor action. And a group of globalist managers within Nissan managed to block him. They managed to find dirt, they dig dirt about him, and they managed to get him out. But that's a very important story. Actually, the book that tells that story was published literally 1 month after Carlos Ghosn was arrested. It's called The Secret Files of Nissan. It's a very important story because Renault should have known when they stepped in 1999 that they were coming in a company where a major battle had just happened 10 years before, and that the nationalists had lost that battle. So knowing that, could they imagine that this time around, not only was Nissan internationalizing, but foreigners were stepping in? Could they really expect that those nationalist elements within Nissan were still around, would sit back and watch? So they had to expect at one point. Mm-hmm. And we both know the Japanese are patient. They can take 10, 15 years, they are patient.
I mean, also, where the story started with Macron, the legislation, we're not sitting here and saying that only the Japanese have a nationalist economic agenda. Every country has a right to kind of defend their interests. So there's nothing wrong with that. Ultimately, also what you were saying is that the structure of the deal did not allow for a rebalancing of responsibilities as the economic realities shifted over 10, 15 years after the rescue of Nissan.
Correct. And the worst thing in this story is that, as you said, it should have been Renault at one point that offered a change to the Japanese in the capital arrangement. They should themselves have realized everything that I've said before: sales, earnings, technology, cash. And they should themselves, while they still had the hand over this whole alliance, offer the Japanese maybe more capital, maybe more voting rights. The terrible thing that the French did is that after after Carlos Ghosn was arrested. The Minister of Economy suggested to the Japanese that France might be willing to consider lowering its shareholding and allowing the Japanese to have a higher shareholding. You don't do that when you've just lost a battle. You do that when you're still in a winning position.
So coming back to the point that you made that new law was put into effect accidentally 1 month before the Ghosn arrest happened, that made this plea bargain arrangement possible. And so there seems to be a bit of correlation of events as well. We were speculating, no?
Coincidence? It's difficult to say, okay, that the prosecutor's office of Tokyo was waiting for this new piece of legislation to come in. There's no proof of that. I'm just mentioning the strange coincidence. And this whole Carlos Ghosn thing is full of very strange coincidences. Coincidences of calendars. Things happening on the very same day that look like retaliation. For example, when Carlos Ghosn was presented to a judge finally, while he was still in jail, and he had about 5 minutes to talk to the judge, and he was brought to the judge on a leash. The pictures were terrible. The very same day, when we knew that the judge was sending him back to jail, we learned in the French press that a French judge is going after the head of the Japanese International Olympic Committee. He thinks that Tokyo bought the games. On the very same day, we learned that. That judge, we know now that he had been investigating really this story for the past 2-3 years. He gets enough evidence, enough elements to go publicly after the president of the Japanese Olympic Committee on the very same day that Carlos Ghosn is presented to a judge. That's a coincidence.
Pure coincidence.
Pure coincidence.
What we shouldn't forget in all of this is obviously the results by Nissan in the last quarter were pretty terrible, but also quite a bit of that is due to Carlos Ghosn's strategy of expanding in the US at whatever it costs. Some would argue probably destroying the brand.
Absolutely. I mean, that's an argument that's been put by Carlos Ghosn himself at very very heavily during his press conference in Lebanon after he's escaped on January 8th. He basically said, and he actually showed a chart, I think. I mean, look at the market capitalization of both Nissan and Renault. Look at the earnings; they're dismal. Market cap is sinking. I think Nissan lost more than 10 billion US in market cap since Carlos Ghosn was arrested. Renault lost over 5 billion euros in market cap. The question is, as you said, is it all because Carlos Ghosn was arrested? It's grossly exaggerated. Of course he's going to say that. But as you reminded people, part of the bad results for Nissan is the Carlos Ghosn very own strategy of pushing for market shares in the North American market at the expense of profitability. Basically, you would have marketing campaigns, almost you buy one, the second one, half price. Obviously, this is terrible for brand equity. And the big paradox in this whole thing is that the person who's now being called by Renault to replace Carlos Ghosn, Luca De Meo, an Italian, who came from SEAT, is coming on the grounds that he has a lot of success with SEAT by doing what? The exact opposite of what Carlos Ghosn did. His success at SEAT was by increasing the price of SEAT to remove that image that SEAT are cheap cars. The fact that Nissan and Renault are suffering right now, it's to an extent due to that. It's also to a very big extent due to the turning around of the auto cycle. Unless Americans and Chinese are buying cars again big time, Renault and Nissan, just like everybody else, are going to suffer. So there's really many different elements. And of course, the way that the arrest of Carlos Ghosn has been managed by Nissan and by Renault didn't help. Something Nissan is not advertising for their cars on TV anymore. When was the last time, Norbert, you live in Tokyo, when was the last time you saw a Nissan TV ad?
Yeah, don't watch Japanese television, unfortunately. It's been a long time.
Well, I've watched some just to check. And indeed, you see Honda big time. You see Toyota everywhere. Not a single TV ad by Nissan. Apparently, the damage to brand equity is so bad that they believe that it would be a waste of money.
Just keep quiet for a while.
Just keep quiet. Try to limit damage and see if they can turn around their North American strategy and their European strategy. Another thing that they're doing quite interestingly back in Europe is that they're using Brexit as an excuse to threaten to close many of their factories in Europe, which would be very interesting because by doing that, it would allow Nissan to scale back the technological convergence that Carlos Ghosn had put in place between Renault and Nissan. If you take their factory in Sunderland in England, for example, that's probably the factory where they have the most advanced, what they call CMF, common module families. So those are basically, it's basically the idea of producing two models for the two brands up to 70% with the same components. So the factory in Sunderland, for example, they build Nissan Qashqai and Renault Kashgar on the same lines. If they close that factory because of Brexit, it enables Nissan to backtrack on that technological convergence. And they can slowly divorce from Renault that way. So I think that's something that people will have to keep in mind. And the excuse because of Brexit, we're going to start hearing it a lot, I think, from now on.
All of this sounds so there's no winners here. Can this be repaired? The alliance, can it continue, or is a divorce unavoidable? And if a divorce happens, what's the future of either side?
I think it's too late to try and salvage that marriage. The working relationship between the French and the Japanese is pretty much permanently damaged. Trust has been shattered. Most of the people who had been put in place, both at Renault and at Nissan by Carlos Ghosn, have been evicted. There's been a real purge in both companies of everybody who owed his career to Carlos Ghosn. How do you work together after what happened? And the two companies have been bleeding money since then. The people have been put in place to replace Carlos Ghosn, to succeed him. I mean, they're great people. Jean-Dominique Sénard from Michelin, great ethics. But does he have the character? Does he have the aggressiveness necessary to impose Renault interests on the Japanese now? Probably not. That's not his style. Luca De Meo, I mean, he's going to come in his new position in July. Everybody tells him that his main strength is that he manages to get consensus. And I think that's where Carlos Ghosn was probably not wrong in his press conference in Lebanon. It's too late for consensus now. If Renault wants to salvage the thing, they have to be able to impose their will to the Japanese and say, okay, we know what you did. This is ugly. This is nasty. We remain married, but the rules are going to change. Obviously, that's not going to happen. What could go on from now on? There's really two scenarios, I think. First, to me, the most realistic scenario is that within the next few years, the alliance is going to collapse. The Japanese, as I said, maybe by backtracking on technological convergence, closing factories here and there, they will succeed in basically putting an end to the alliance de facto, especially since Renault is short of cash. They need cash. And Citibank put out a very interesting analyst report a couple of weeks ago mentioning that problem that Renault has with cash, and pretty much saying that pretty much the only solution for Renault is to start selling their shares in Nissan. So Nissan might be freed by Renault if Renault is having troubles. The question is, what happens after? Do you leave Nissan alone after losing over 10 billion in market cap? Do you leave Mitsubishi alone? So that's where another set of scenarios could come in after that first one. And I believe that the Japanese could be very much tempted to use this opportunity to start a consolidation of the auto industry in Japan. So consolidation could mean two things. Either they consolidate with other auto manufacturers. That could be a problem for the antitrust authorities in Japan. Because if you merge Nissan with Toyota, for example, then you have a giant that controls over 60 or 70% of market share in Japan. Antitrust authorities in Japan will not like that. Maybe they could merge them with smaller players, a Suzuki, a Daihatsu, Mazda, maybe. That would remain to be seen whether antitrust authorities would accept that. But another angle could be, how about a company like Sony? A company that has nothing to do with automobile, cash rich, company that just presented a prototype of EV model at CES 2020 in Las Vegas. Could they be interested in getting the hardware, the technology of a Nissan, which is much cheaper now? Another scenario could also be private equity funds. Could a Cargill, a KKR, a BlackRock could be interested to delist Nissan, turn it around, termination of board, turn around, and relist? I think those are options on the table. It's just that to me, for Japan, it doesn't make sense to stop here. They've gone too far in this economic warfare with France. It's a Pyrrhic victory for them. They've pretty much achieved many of their goals, but at what cost? So you don't stop there.
Now there's an opportunity to build a bridge towards FinTech, right, in terms of the Sony proposal that you just laid out, or the possibility, right? So we obviously have FinTech companies, neobanks that are coming up and growing very fast at high valuations, maybe not quite high enough to buy one of the larger legacy brands, but You have an entity that's new technology, is acquiring new customers quite rapidly. Why would you buy a legacy asset like a Deutsche Bank, for example? Because that's maybe the equivalent of having lost so much market value. And then you've got all the problems of legacy business, legacy technology, etc. Wouldn't Sony be better off just building their electronic car like Musk-like Tesla copy without having the burden of a legacy Nissan attached?
If we stick to the example of Sony, and that was just meant as an example, if I'm a Sony, do I want to go the Elon Musk road, or am I interested in taking over a weakened Nissan? I think I would prefer a weakened Nissan. Why? Because at Sony, I have a couple of businesses that are already burdens. The movie studios, they're under pressure from the likes of Netflix, Amazon Prime, and all that. So that's really not working out for Sony. Sony Interactive, the video games, this is very difficult. They're getting a lot of competition from Chinese players on video games. The stereo system and all the electronics, I mean, you can see the sales worldwide in the markets that they are usually originally very strong in. You can see the impact in Japan in the domestic market of the increase in VAT. So they're carrying a lot of burdens already, which was not the case of Elon Musk. He could pretty much allocate most of his resources, if not all of his resources on that. Sony cannot. So by going with what you call legacy assets, and in this case in the likes of a Nissan, I think they would gain a lot of time. I think what they did at CES 2020 in Las Vegas with a prototype is just to show actors that, guys, you have people that you may not have thought of who are going to come in on this EV thing. It doesn't mean that they're going to come in alone. And I think they could go in with a Panasonic, but I think it would make more sense to go in with a weakened Nissan, because Nissan is weakened so much that termination of board, it's like a hanging fruit. It's ready to, it's ripe for the picking. So they could impose that easily. It would remain among Japanese companies. So Japan Incorporated would appreciate that. At least there would be no opposition to that, obviously. And we have to remember that Shinzo Abe, the prime minister, is probably not going to sit for another term. So there's a big question mark. Who's going to succeed him? Who will be coming after? And those are pretty much all fairly nationalistic people. So yeah, I think to answer your question, it would make more sense. If Sony had gotten rid of all those businesses that were not working out for them before, then they could really focus on going it alone.
So it will be interesting to see how this plays out. So ultimately, the reason we're having this discussion is that you're not only passionate about these topics, clearly, but it's also your business.
Correct.
You're trying to solve the question, what are the lessons learned for foreign companies entering in Japan or entering business alliances in Japan from everything that happened? Without giving away all the knowledge and the conclusions, what would you tell your clients at this point?
What I tell my clients when they're considering, as you said, alliances in Japan or within Asia in general for that matter, because the Koreans, the Chinese, the Taiwanese, the Singaporeans are pretty much like the Japanese. And that's what you said earlier. This is actually a good thing. I've used the word nationalistic, but this is economic patriotism. That's a good thing. And I wish France was doing more of that. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make sure that those clients are aware that these countries are staunchly patriotic when it comes to the economy, that they see the economy as a way to increase their power, and that sometimes in their interest they accept alliances, sometimes they're not in a position to reject takeover propositions, but it does not mean that they will not start questioning a few years down the road. And Nissan, for that matter, I think is the perfect example. There's been other stories, obviously, in Japan of foreign CEOs that had various degrees of success, but very few actually match what happened with Carlos Ghosn, and very few have a story that really concentrates all these elements of economic warfare. Probably the only element of economic warfare that we cannot find, or that I haven't found in the Renault Nissan case, is cyber warfare. But pretty much all the rest, how to use the legal system for power, how to use influence, how to use the media, how to use financial instruments, the legal systems, pretty much everything. Yeah, the advice is really know what you're getting to, do your due diligence, and that's the reason why I mentioned that story from the mid-80s. Do your cultural and historical due diligence of the company. Know what happened before you stepped in. This is a new house for you. You may have the keys. Maybe you change the locks. But you should know that there are bodies in the closets, that there are people still fighting. If Carlos Ghosn had been the genius he claims to be, he would have identified those nationalist elements. He would have been able to disarm them. If he had been even more of a genius, he would have been able to put them on his side to make them understand that this was their interest. Mm-hmm. There would have been the genius of Carlos Ghosn. Economic patriotism element is something I see pretty much everywhere in Asia. It's very strong. Obviously, the Americans do it to perfection and they have that power. They use their legal system to enforce that. Most European countries do that too. I mean, Germany is blocking many attempts by Chinese companies to take over some of their strategic assets. So there is strong defensive patriotism in Germany. Italy and Spain. France seems to be having a hard time, at least our political leaders seem to be having a hard time realizing that trading with people is not about making friends.
But it helps to be friends.
It helps to be friends when we are sure that it's both in our interests, but most of the times there is a conflict of power. And maybe a last example. 1913, 1 year before the start of the First World War. Economists have calculated the intensity of trade between Germany and Great Britain. Intensity of trade in 1913 was at a high historical point. Never in history had trade between those two nations been that intense. And that was 1 year before the First World War. Trade does not guarantee peace. If anything, wars very often are fought over trade.
I think in the current environment, there's a bit of a risk that many foreigners outside of Japan, at least who don't know the country that well, just see this as a bit of xenophobia and saying like we need to get rid of the foreigners. Obviously, Japan is going through cycles where sometimes they're more open, sometimes they're less open to foreign influence, and we might be a bit on the lesser side right now. At the same time, there are other cases of failure and success, and let's start to round it out maybe with the failure. And we have the Olympus example that we previously talked about of CEO who was let go after just a few days in power.
Absolutely.
But based on your analysis, that was his own fault. He didn't play by the rules.
That's a typical example. The example of Michael Woodford, who became CEO of Olympus after a major accounting scandal. It's one of the stories that people tell you to confirm that after Carlos Ghosn being the latest example, Japan has a problem with foreign CEOs. To me, it's a gross exaggeration. If you go back to what happened to Michael Woodford, he became CEO because the accounting scandals were getting so big that the board of directors thought, okay, let's try and change the whole image. And by bringing a foreigner, Michael Woodford had been with Olympus for a long time, so he had gone up the ranks. But the board of directors thought, if we bring in a foreigner as a CEO, it's going to change the whole image. So he came in. What did he do? He thought, okay, this accounting scandal, we haven't gotten to the bottom of this. My job as a CEO and my responsibility as a CEO is to get to the bottom of it. He received a report by PricewaterhouseCoopers that explained in detail the nature of the accounting problems. And Michael Woodford went straight to the press with that. If I'm not mistaken, I think Financial Times. He spilled the beans, so to speak. If he had done the one thing that every foreign executive should do as first that they get their job in Japan. If Michael Woodford had gone to a lawyer, that lawyer would have told him, Mr. Woodford, there's a new legislation that's been put forward by the Financial Services Authority, the FSA. In such a case, what you need to do is go to the auditor, which at that time was Ernst & Young, tell them that you have proof of gross misconduct, also on the part of Ernst & Young. So either they rewrite the books correctly, or you have to go to the FSA and pretty much tell them. And then the FSA will force them or remove their license. If he had known that, he could have done exactly that. By going to the press, he did two things. First of all, in Japan, as you know, you don't wash the dirty laundry in public. You don't go to the press in public. You deal with your own mess internally first. So he violated a basic cultural rule, a basic business practice rule of Japan.
Probably not only Japan, right?
And not only Japan,
but that would be a no.
Absolutely. But Japan is particularly sensitive about that. And the second thing that he did is what he was in gross breach of his duty as a CEO, as an administrator, to be quiet about those things. He was not supposed to go public with it. So they used that reason to remove him. And indeed, he was removed after less than 2 weeks. So to say that Michael Woodford was targeted because he was a fraudulent CEO, I think, again, gross exaggeration. I can live with hearing that being foreigner as a CEO, you might have some sort of target on your back. It doesn't mean they're going to fire at you. Maybe they're going to be less patient. Maybe there's narrower margin of error if you're a foreigner. But to say that they've been targeted because they were foreigners, no. They were nominated because they were foreigners. So let's not turn the whole thing around. And a success story, Christophe Weber at Takeda. Frenchman. Another Frenchman, Christophe Weber, CEO of Takeda Pharmaceutical, the number one Japanese pharmaceutical company, and I think one of the biggest in Asia too. Tremendous success. How long is that going to last? We'll see. Time will tell. But so far, there seems to be fairly total acceptance of the fact that the foreign CEO is in place, that he's surrounding himself with a lot of foreigners. I'm told that now Takeda Pharmaceutical worldwide is made up of close to 80% foreigners. But the guy still did the largest M&A deal in the history of Japan less than 2 years ago by taking over Shire of Ireland. So as long as it still does that, probably Japan Incorporated is happy with it. We'll see how long it lasts. But that's so far a big success story. So yes, that's what I would answer to people who say foreign CEOs Japan doesn't like. Say, well,
and even leaving aside foreign CEOs, if we're looking at Japanese companies with the declining domestic market in terms of the population, many of them are looking abroad for growth. And so even in financial services, you see players like Tokyo Fire Marine being 50% foreign revenue. Our sample, I think, is much less. It's about 30, but they would love to get more to more balanced one. And so even if you don't have foreigners in the mix, you have foreign businesses in the mix, and maybe still fractions inside the company that have grown up domestically or that have come the international business way and integrating these acquisitions, for example. So it will be interesting to watch how that develops over the next 5 to 10 years maybe.
Correct. And I think we've got some pretty good examples like Rakuten or SoftBank also. The way those companies have been internationalized voluntarily by the CEO from the inside. The question is, how good are these Japanese companies at scaling their business overseas? Many of them have not proven to be that strong in scaling the business. I think Rakuten is a good example. I'm from France. They took over a fairly big player, Price Minister, but Rakuten as a brand itself, it's not really picking up. Take another example. I was told about this example by a management consultant, Japanese management consultant that I met during this trip in Japan. He was telling me to look at Yamato Transport. Yamato Transport, to him, and I found this example fascinating, to him it's the perfect example of a highly successful Japanese company in a dominating position on the domestic market that has the biggest difficulties in scaling the business overseas. Why? Because they're hooked to perfectionism. And perfectionism only takes in Japan. How many pickup collection spots do they have in Japan? I think over 100,000? That's impossible to replicate in another market. And it's not even required, it's not even a good idea to try to replicate that. And so that seems to be the issue of many Japanese companies. Their entire business model is built on top-notch service, super high quality. And when they try to go overseas, they try to replicate that. And they waste time, money, and resources because the local environments are not ready for that, don't even require that, or the local environments don't pay a premium for that, plain and simple. Back home in France, people don't request that kind of quality.
Cool. Final words?
Well, final words, I gotta say, this coronavirus thing, this trip that I'm doing now, and it's closing on the end, falls right in the middle of this coronavirus crisis. I'm always amazed. I've lived through SARS in Hong Kong back in 2003 or something. I lived through that in Hong Kong. And I remember already at that time, I had friends, family sending pictures of Hong Kong, say, is everything okay in Hong Kong? The pictures look terrifying, like entire areas of Hong Kong, like empty. Like that movie 28 Days Later, when the guy wakes up from the hospital and walks around in London empty. And I was looking at those pictures and I was like, which part of Hong Kong is this? I want to see it because I can recognize that part. Where did they go to take those pictures? And I'm seeing the exact same thing with coronavirus. I know people who live in China. They're telling me, not in Wuhan is special, but in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, in Beijing, they tell me, yeah, things are quieter, but we keep living. We still go to work. And what I see here in Tokyo, this is winter. You've lived here long. People wear masks in winter anyway. be it to avoid the flu or at the end of winter to avoid pollen. I'm not really seeing more people wearing masks than usual. I see quite a few not wearing any. I hear that teleworking, distance working is starting to pick up slowly. I mean, some companies had 1 or 2 employees who got infected, so they're sending every back home, like Dentsu. I hear Shiseido is starting. But for the most part, I see a lot of panicking back in Europe and pretty much no panicking here in Japan. And I was having this discussion with a Japanese friend the other day, and he's telling me, we've gone through Fukushima. We get earthquakes. We're waiting for the next eruption of Mount Fuji. We're going to be scared of this? There's not even 100 people dead in Japan because of that. How many people does the flu, the seasonal flu, kill every year? Now, the one interesting thing about this coronavirus, I think, is that it's having everybody realize the cost of economic dependence to China. All companies worldwide are realizing that the supply chains are collapsing completely just because of that. And again, when you look at the number of actually people dying of this, it shows the level, how fragile our supply chains are and how easily they can be turned upside down and they can collapse.
Totally.
For something like this, not even 10,000 dead worldwide, not even 5,000 dead. Yeah. So I think if something good comes out of this, economically speaking, it should be a realization that in many industries, pharmaceutical could be one, because we're starting to lack some medicines back in Europe because most of them are manufactured in China. If you should have us realize something, that we need to rebalance those supply chains. We need to repatriate factories. This massive dependence on China has gone way too far. In Japan, Panasonic, Toyota, Nissan, Honda, they had to close down the factories. The entire supply chain is blocked. Basically, nothing is coming out anymore because the spare parts are not coming in from the Chinese factories because of that. And that's pretty much throughout China. I think I was reading the PMI from China that's totally collapsing, the biggest collapse in modern history.
Right.
Let's hope something good comes out of this. Many doctors say, come on, this is not the Black Plague. And I think the speech that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe made on Friday was very reassuring, saying that, okay, people, let's calm down. Do not rush to hospitals when you start having a runny nose. Let the hospitals keep their capacity for the people who need it, the elderly, the people with breathing. Yeah. If you start having flu symptoms, just stay home, take your medicine, like if you had a normal flu. If it carries on for too long, then you start calling on the hospital system. Otherwise, let us work. The health systems are not extendable indefinitely. And back in Europe, budgets have collapsed in many countries, like in France. Yeah. So the hospitals cannot cope with this kind of reaction from the population, this panic reaction.
Not even mentioning the US, where allegedly a coronavirus test costs you $3,000.
Exactly.
So I think,
exactly.
And so we are still better off in the European countries and in Japan.
Still.
So. Wow, that's a great conversation. Thank you very much, Nicolas.
Thanks, Norbert. Thanks for having me.
We're going to do this again in a year's time or so. We can reflect back on what has happened since we last spoke and how the Renault-Nissan alliance and all these relationships have developed.
Absolutely. Thanks, Norbert.
Thank you very much. Stay safe and safe trip back.